Can we decide to keep the Sabbath or not? My name is Melvin. Welcome to the series Sabbath Questions, in which we discuss 13 popular questions about whether the Sabbath is still relevant for us as Christians or not. There's a verse that we'll soon read together that has caused some to believe that it's up to each individual to make up in their own mind whether to keep the Sabbath or not. But since God calls this Sabbath day His holy day, we don't want to get it wrong and neglect what He has commanded us to keep holy. But before we get there, the comment challenge of this episode, comment below if you have, why and when did you decide to keep the Sabbath? I'd love to see the comment section below turn into a nostalgic walk down memory lane. Well, let's jump right into this second problematic passage from Paul in this series. Is he telling us that we can decide to keep the Sabbath or not? He writes, "One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it." When you read this verse with the Sabbath in mind, then it looks like Paul says, you can decide whatever you want. Just be convinced about it yourself. It's fully up to you. The crucial question that we need to ask is, was it Paul's intention for us to read this verse with the Sabbath day in mind? Did you know that not once in the entire letter to the Romans does Paul mention the Sabbath? Now this should make us think, wouldn't you expect that if Paul would have meant the weekly Sabbath day, that he would clarify that somehow? The Sabbath having been their custom for thousands of years, it was sacred, a huge deal, and God calls it His holy day. They were to stone Sabbath breakers, and breaking the Sabbath was part of the reason why they were sent into Babylonian captivity. But here, Paul just casually calls it a day and says, hey, now you can do with it what you want. It doesn't matter anymore. The seventh-day Sabbath is never referred to by just a day. So what then is Paul talking about? Well, this is something that we sometimes forget when it comes to reading the Bible. It's not a collection of just random disconnected sayings and phrases. Just because we have numbered verses, it doesn't mean we can just take one and interpret it how we want. It's all written in a context. He said things before, he said things after, and when you read all of it, it becomes clear as day, pun intended, what he is talking about and what he's not talking about. In this part of his letter, Paul is talking about how to deal with Christians who aren't yet so strong in the faith. When he wrote this letter, his direct audience consisted out of immature Christians, new converts from both Judaism as well as paganism, and they didn't fully grasp the principles of righteousness by faith, that you are saved by faith alone. Both of these groups, they were very used to this mentality of needing to do good to get good. The pagan religions and Judaism, they both consisted out of rituals and ceremonies and duties, and they were used to believing that these things were essential for their salvation or their faith. We call this concept righteousness by works. So now they have just accepted Jesus, converted to Christianity. Yes! But what now? What should we do? What should we not do? And they're eager to be saved, willing to do whatever they believe is required of them. So a lot of the letters in the New Testament address all kinds of these new situations that these new converts find themselves in. For example, an issue that Paul addresses both in this chapter as well as in a letter to the Corinthians is food offered to idols. The newly converted Christians that came from paganism, they were used to eating food that was offered to idols. But now some are like, I don't feel comfortable with that anymore. I don't believe I should do that. It's reminding me too much of my former life that I'm trying to leave behind. So they abstain from all those foods. And Paul is saying, hey, these false gods that the food is dedicated to, they don't exist. They're not real. So it's no problem if you want to eat the food, even though it's dedicated to them. You can have faith and it's fine. But if you don't have that faith, if you're persuaded that you shouldn't eat it, then don't eat it. And also, if you do have that faith, don't judge others that don't. And not just that, Paul takes it a step further and he says, if you eating food offered to idols, even though you may have faith for it, if it's making someone else who's weaker in their faith, if it makes them stumble, then you stop eating it for their sake. And along those same lines, Paul is bringing up this comment about days. There were certain Jewish holy days that were connected to the annual feasts of Judaism. Now, it wasn't so long before that Jesus had died and resurrected before Paul was writing this, and many of the new Christians, the Jewish converts, they didn't yet fully comprehend that the ceremonial system that had been in place for millennia had now found its fulfillment in the life and ministry of Jesus, and that it was no longer binding to them. And instead of Paul and these other New Testament authors, being incredibly strict about this, you cannot do this anymore, stop it immediately. They instead allow some of these elements of the ceremonial law to just gradually disappear, like a transitional period, as the minds and conscience of these converts becomes more enlightened. And Paul himself, he even attended some annual feasts. He had Timothy circumcised. He agreed to fulfill this certain vow with a purification ritual. None of these things he did for himself. He had faith that none of these things were binding on him anymore. But he did it based on this principle that he's promoting for the good of the faith of others. So Paul is not saying that, hey, now anyone can decide for themselves, keep the seventh-day Sabbath or not, hey, up to you. The Sabbath was not one of those ceremonial days. It wasn't a shadow that later found its fulfillment in Jesus. The Sabbath day is like no other day, no matter what we may think or say, because God made it holy. He made it different and unique all the way back in creation week. It's the day that he has called holy and tells us to keep holy too. Up next in the series, Paul's comments in Galatians chapter 4. Is the Sabbath a bondage to which we shouldn't return? Remember, you don't just want to be a hearer of the word, you want to be a doer. And the best way for you to make this message your own, to really learn from it, to act on it in your life, and be able to teach it to others, is to write down in your own words what you have learned. So comment below your summary of this episode. I'll choose one of them and I'll pin ya. Maranatha from Norway.